be seated. Friday night, I attended the Shabbat service offered by Temple Beth Tefillah over in Brunswick. St. Mark's hosted it for what ended up being a standing room only congregation. Rabbi Bregman said many wonderful things and challenging things in her sermon towards the end of that service. But one of the quotes that she gave has stuck with me, and I've been thinking about it ever since Friday night. It's a quote from Golda Meir, the former Prime Minister of Israel, that she both said and then put in a book later. This is going to be about 90% accurate because I'm not Golda Meir and I don't have it in front of me. But she said, in time, we can learn to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but harder will be learning to forgive them for forcing us to kill their sons. Peace will come when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us. I was like, wow, that really gets to the heart of human beings when we get into these moments of violence and war and what's at the center of it. She shared that quote as she was reflecting on the other aspect that makes what is happening in the Middle East so terrible. There is no justification for what Hamas has done, this great evil terroristic act that took the lives of so many civilians and kidnapped others. There is no way to make that okay. And even those who were in full support of Israel and the Israeli nation for what has happened also are aware that there's some pretty gruesome stuff that is unfolding and about to unfold as Israel responds, as is their right, as they should, as I think we all understand. If there's a nation in modern history that understands what Israelis are feeling this week, it's us. Right? You remember the days after 9/11 when we wanted someone to be held accountable? When we wanted to do whatever it took to make sure it didn't happen again. We still feel that way, right? We still see this impacting decisions we make inside our borders and outside our borders. It's natural. We understand a little bit about what they're going through, even though their situation's different and a little more complex in many ways than ours. We get it. And there is grief on the Israeli side because they recognize they're being forced to do some things that will kill innocent people. And that's as unforgivable as the terrorist acts themselves. That Hamas has this track record of hiding behind innocent people, knowing that retaliation is coming. And it's just horrible. It's just horrible in any war that has to happen. And so that has stuck with me. And I've thought about that and how true that statement is, not just in the conflict between Israelis and Arab folks, Palestinians, but in our own hearts and our own experiences, where there is the challenge for which one is going to win, love or hate. And until love wins, we don't know the path to peace. I said in my letter to the congregation this week that when we took our pilgrimage to Israel in 2019, Christ Church had people go along with members of St. Simon's Presbyterian and Temple Beth Tefillah, and we went as a group and we worked with a tour company whose organizing principle is around exploring peace in the Middle East, not just visiting the holy sites for their own sake, but recognizing all that goes into the history and the modern conflict there and how it is that there might be a way to move beyond that to a place of peace. And I shared with you in the letter the refrain that we heard again and again. It's complicated. It's not a funny phrase, but we started to laugh nervously after about the 6th time we heard somebody say that. We heard from Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews. We heard from atheists. We heard from Israelis who were not sure they agreed with everything their country did. We met with Christians of different origins and stripes, including Palestinian Christians. We met with Arabs and Muslims who had different viewpoints of the world, from wanting to seek peace, and the one imam I remember who blamed everything in the Middle East, all the problems of the Middle East, on the United States, as though they were anywhere near as modern as our nation is. But the one thing that kept happening is when our group would try to inquire about, well, what is the path forward? What does it look like? How is peace achievable? It's complicated. I don't think anybody knows the path to peace in the Middle East. I don't know if anybody knows it's possible, and we get a little glimpse of what the peace that surpasses understanding is all about, because it's often beyond our ability to grasp and find a way through. And so conflict in the Middle East today is just part of a cycle of conflict in that region that has always existed. We know this as we read through the tradition that we come out of, right? In the Hebrew Scriptures and the Old Testament Game of Thrones, where nations rise and fall and empires rise and fall and people do what they need to take care of themselves. And then you have God's chosen people, the Israelites, who are promised a land of their own. With one little hiccup, there was already people dwelling in that land. And Scripture records how they went about clearing that land so they could inhabit what God had promised to them. I'm not going to suggest that what's going on in the Middle East right now is a biblical war, but we can't take the Bible completely out of it. That's how long this has been going on and all that is wrapped up in it. And again, it's very complex when you look at the history. You go back 100 years and you look at a map of Palestine and where Palestinian people lived, and you look at it now, it's dramatically different. And you understand why there's tension there and why there has been violence. We forget that's a part of our own history sometimes. We're a colonial congregation here at Christ Church, right? We celebrate the beginning of Anglicanism on these shores from 1732 when Oglethorpe arrived over at Fort Frederica. We have it enshrined in stained glass windows in the back of the church. And our stained glass version, which is worth celebrating, we celebrate it. That's an important moment in our history. And the fact that Charles Wesley was here is something that's definitely worth celebrating as he served as a missionary. But we forget that not all of it was stained glass in the sense that there were already people living here. This is a week after Columbus Day, which is also now known as Indigenous Peoples Day, right? Because one version says, hey, we found this land and made it ours, and we celebrate that. And the other recognition is, yeah, and there were people here, and we tend to forget that. So now we try to remember both. But we don't put the unpleasant sides of that in our stained glass windows. We celebrate the handshake with Tamachichi and Oglethorpe, which is worth celebrating. And sometimes skip over the part where things got a lot more dicey and a lot more violent as colonization spread west, and there were already people there. We wouldn't do it again, and we can't undo it. But it's a part of our history, and so we understand that tension because it doesn't belong just to the Middle East. It doesn't just belong to us. It doesn't just belong to Europe or Africa or any of the other continents. This is humankind and how we've interacted with each other as long as we have been humans living in the same places. Somehow there's a peace that's possible, but it is beyond our understanding, to be sure. This is an interesting set of readings today in light of the last week, because we get a little glimpse of the Hebrew Scriptures and how we see God's hand in the destruction of peoples and cities. We heard the celebration of the destruction of the city of the aliens, laid waste, which allowed for God's people to feel safe and secure and thrive, as we hear the description of the feast that is promised with good food and well-aged wine. And we understand how long this has been a way of interpreting God, God's will, God's providence, and what is God's promise. Even the gospel today presents a little bit of challenge as we read this parable that Jesus gives, again, while he's still in conflict with the temple authorities in Jerusalem. They're still locking horns, and he teaches them this parable of the king who throws a party that no one wants to come to. When he sends his servants to try to force the issue, there's conflict as a result. And then it says he destroys those people, burns their cities. And it gets even more challenging because then the king goes and says, well, get anybody you can, even the folks who weren't expecting to come and be invited, go bring them in, which sounds like a great invitation until we get to the part where the one guy doesn't have the right clothes on. I mean, imagine if you're at Harris Teeter in your casual clothes doing your weekly shopping and somebody grabs you up and says, come with me to Sea Island. There's a political dignitary hosting a ball and we need more people. You get in there and all of a sudden the security team comes rushing at you, roughs you up, throws you outside the gates because you didn't come in black tie. I mean, what do you expect of people? This is another one of those parables where the allegory only goes so far, and it bumps up against what else we know of God and God's goodness and God's mercy and God's love. But again, Jesus is in a fight with some Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes and elders, and he's trying to make points to them about power and authority, refusing invitation, and all the rest. I don't know that we know the way to peace in the Middle East. I don't know that we know the way to peace in our own hearts. The quote from Golda Meir that we hope that the love for our children is greater than the hatred we have for others is one that starts with us as well. To figure out all the ways in which we find to be hateful towards each other, to diminish one another, and realize there's something more important here. There is that refrain we hear week after week, love your neighbor as yourself, which we fail week after week to live into because we're human beings and it's hard work. There is a sense that the sky is not falling, but there is a sense that the winds have shifted in the last couple of decades, right? Not just on our shores, but around the world. The person who wrote the prayers for this month used the word autocratic, which is not a word I use a lot, but it's been in my mind because of the prayers of the people, which are here again today. The rise of autocratic nations, of places where democracy is under attack, of places where force and violence wins the day in ways we haven't seen in a while, and wondering how we prevent that wind from blowing harder and harder as it did 100 years ago, leading to a tremendous conflagration that enveloped the whole world for the second time. I've been reading, actually listening on Audible to Stephen Ambrose's book D-Day, which is a 26-hour listen, but it's a wonderful book. One of the things that he touches on in the first part of the book is that the Germans really weren't worried about the Americans showing up in the war. Their think tanks, their propagandists, who were so proud of their ideology, their love for the fatherland and the race that was German and the history and tradition that was there, they thought there was no way that soldiers from a democracy that encourages individualism and individual rights could ever stand against them. That when force met against force, those American soldiers would turn to their self-interest and lose the fight, to give up before they would go to their deaths. They didn't have anything worth fighting for on the level of the German army. But as he's gotten further into the book now in the second half and they've landed on the shores, he's circled back around to that mindset to suggest how quickly they were proven wrong. There is value in the idea of unity across division, of unity when we think differently and we look differently, we pray differently, we believe differently. People showed that that could do amazing things in the world, and that stood up to an idea that said, we'll take what we want for ourselves, thank you very much. And for at least 80 years until Ukraine was invaded in the West, that ideal has held up. And at a time when those ideals are challenged all over the world, we have to put things in their right order. Love for ourselves, love for our children, love for our neighbor, before the self-interest, before the hatred that divides different group from different group, nation from nation, religion from religion, skin color from skin color, whatever it is. Because that's all that we have. The only hope we have, the only way to peace is that we know of is the way of Jesus Christ, that we repeatedly fail at but keep coming back to again and again. And that if we hold that close at heart, that we don't fear the valley of any shadow of death and the evil that lurks there. The people of the Middle East don't need to be fearful of that evil as long as they hold fast to these things. It's complex, right? There's not going to be an easy solution to this. There is going to be more violence, to be sure. But our hope is that we learn to look to the future in the place in which As Isaiah described, there is no more suffering and no more tear. There is no more conflict and war. That peace that surpasses all understanding finally descends on the world. We look to that and we try to live into it in our hearts, in our communities, in our own nation, at every level we can think of. Because that's all that we have. And the only way that we can be in faith with what God has called us to do.